we're just hours away from the Trump-Putin summit. The two leaders are both right now preparing to fly to Alaska, where they will meet one-on-one. This will be the first in-person meeting of these two leaders in years. President Trump today said that he expects this meeting with Putin will be productive.
I believe now he's convinced that he's going to make a deal. He's going to make a deal. I think he's going to, and we're going to find out. I'm going to know very quickly.
And of course, just a few minutes later, President Trump conceded that there's a 25% chance in his mind this meeting is a failure. As for Putin, he's working the flattery angle with President Trump.
The current American administration, which, as everyone knows, is making, in my opinion, quite energetic and sincere efforts to stop the hostilities, stop the crisis, and reach agreements that are of interest to all parties involved in this conflict.
Putin knows that praising Trump has definitely worked in the past. Remember, when the two men met in 2018, they stood side by side as President Trump sided with Vladimir Putin over U.S. intelligence agencies about Russian interference in the 2016 election. And despite what we all know to be the truth about the Russian leader, the president has spent years praising him.
I also have a very good relationship, as you know, with President Putin. I knew Putin very well, got along with him actually great.
Putin is a nicer person than I am.
So now I like Putin. Now, Putin called me a genius, by the way.
But Putin has reason to worry. Trump's tone has changed in recent months.
I was very unhappy with my call with President Putin, and it just seems like he wants to go all the way and just keep killing people.
I'm not happy with President Putin at all. We get a lot of bullshit thrown at us by Putin. I'm disappointed in President Putin. Very disappointed in him.
And now we're just hours away from the two meeting once again. Some European officials tell CNN that they're concerned that Putin could sway Trump yet again. One official saying that Trump, quote, must be prepared because Putin is very, very well prepared. Kristen Holmes is out front in Alaska ahead of the president's arrival there. Kristen, what more are you learning about the president's thinking going into this?
Yeah, and Kate, just one thing to note, it's not just the Europeans who have been afraid of that. I mean, I've talked to U.S. officials who always are worried that President Trump could go in there with the Russian president and be charmed by him. It is not uncommon for people to be charmed by Vladimir Putin. Now, when it comes to the president's mentality, he is at least going into this more clear-headed and open-eyed than we've seen him in the past because of the fact that he has been really embarrassed by the Russian president this time around on multiple occasions. He's held a number of phone calls with Putin in which Putin has made him promises. At the beginning, President Trump would talk about what they talked about on the phone. Then he stopped because afterwards there would be more bombs dropped in Ukraine. So you're seeing a lot of caveats from President Trump. But I did talk to members of his team today who say they are feeling more optimistic by the day as they get closer to that sit down. Now, one of the interesting things that President Trump floated today was this idea that right after the meeting, there would be some kind of trilateral meeting with President Zelensky of Ukraine, that essentially they would call him if things were going well and bring him to Alaska. Now, this is something that had been floated to me roughly a week ago. Ukrainian officials are pouring water on this idea, saying it would be nearly impossible to get Zelensky here in time to have a meeting the next day. But it gives you a little bit of an idea of where Trump's mindset is at. Part of the reason that they are rushing this, that they are moving so quickly with the meeting with Putin and this idea of a potential trilateral meeting right afterwards is because they want to strike while the iron is hot. And they understand that they might have a limited window if, in fact, the Russian president does make any concessions or does seem willing to make a deal with the United States, with Ukraine, with European leaders. But one thing that was also interesting about this trilateral meeting, at one point he seemed to suggest that it might also include European leaders. This time around, he is leaning very heavily on those European allies going into this meeting in a way that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, it's been suggested to me that the Europeans have to be in this meeting eventually for this all to work out. Kristen, great to see you. Thank you so much for being there.
President Putin would like to see a deal. I think if I weren't president, he would take over all of Ukraine. But I am president, and he's not going to mess around with me.
That was President Trump this afternoon in the White House, one day before he meets face-to-face with Russian leader Vladimir Putin right here in Anchorage, Alaska. Joining me now, Dr. Kenneth Dekleva. He's a psychiatrist, former regional medical officer at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Kenneth, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
Earlier this year, you wrote in the Cipher brief, quoting, negotiating with Putin, a trained KGB officer, politician, diplomat, and currently indicted war criminal, presents unique challenges for even the most talented politicians. So I wonder, as Trump goes into this meeting tomorrow, what's his best angle? And is there a smart way to play Vladimir Putin?
I think there is. And so far, I think President Trump, and starting with Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, have offered something to Putin that he wants that wasn't talked about in the earlier segments, but it is a way back from his pariah status, which includes being an indicted war criminal, by treating and appealing to Putin's sense of respect, dignity, and treating him with empathy. They've avoided name calling. They've been very careful in their comments about President Putin. And I think Trump has offered a lot. That being said, it also has to be remembered, President Putin is a nuclear armed hostage taker whose country holds 20,000 Ukrainian children hostage. And I think President Trump should set a high bar in terms of reciprocity. President Trump has given President Putin something, and that's a good negotiating strategy. President Putin must now respond with a ceasefire and releasing the 20,000 Ukrainian children.
At least in his public comments recently, President Trump has been more critical of Putin. He recently accused him of peddling bullshit over the phone. He hasn't backed that up with new penalties against Russia, but at least his public comments have been critical. Do you believe Putin is likely to believe, even fear, that Trump's view of him has changed?
I think President Putin should be very careful. I think it's an excellent point. A lot of the media, even in Russia, has really downgraded President Trump's efforts, which I actually applaud, in bringing this meeting together. But given President Trump's recent successes in negotiating other difficult conflicts, both during his first term with the Abraham Accords and more recently between Rwanda, Congo, and importantly, just last Friday between Armenia and Azerbaijan, President Trump's on a roll. And I think President Putin should be very careful not to underestimate President Trump. A lot of politicians have done that and been forced to eat crow.
Do you believe Trump's discussion, at least discussion of more sanctions, but also that the Iran strike might factor into Putin's calculus, that he saw President Trump, granted on a small scale, big attacks over the course of just one day, willing to strike Iran, that might at least raise a question in Putin's mind as to how far Trump might be willing to go as relates to the war in Ukraine?
100%. I think the strike against Iran showed what many people would call controlled deterrence, and it showed resolve, a Reagan-esque resolve on President Trump's part. And I think President Putin, I'm sure that has changed his calculus in the sense that at least it's got to give him a sense of pause, that this is a different President Trump than the President Trump he dealt with during President Trump's first term.
We'll see how that all comes together tomorrow. Dr. Kenneth de Kleve, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for hosting me.